My name is Susan, and I want to share a part of my life that changed everything for me. It's a story about family, sacrifice, and the struggle to hold on to who you are. I hope by telling it, you'll understand just how quickly life can spiral when responsibilities weigh too heavily on our hearts. It all started in Seattle, where Mike and I had crafted a comfortable life for ourselves. I was a 40-year-old graphic designer, and Mike was a software developer in his mid-40s. Our routine was predictable but cozy. We had a small, rented apartment with views of the city skyline, and our weekends were filled with hikes and relaxing dinners at our favorite spots. It was far from perfect, but it was our little bubble of happiness. Then everything changed. Mike's father passed away unexpectedly. The news hit us like a freight train. While we were mourning his loss, we were also faced with the stark reality of what was left behind. Mike's mother, Margaret, was a 75-year-old widow who had lived in the same large, old house for decades. It was a beautiful home, though somewhat gloomy and in need of renovation. The house had seen better days, much like Margaret herself. Mike was devastated. I watched as his grief turned into a fierce determination to take care of his mother. His sense of responsibility was strong, almost overwhelming. He felt that moving in with Margaret was the only way to honor his father's memory and support her through this tough time. To be honest, I was uneasy about the idea. Margaret and I had never had a smooth relationship. She was always critical, and her strict demeanor had been a source of tension between us. But Mike's plea and his palpable sense of duty made it hard for me to argue. So, we packed up our life in Seattle and moved into Margaret's old house. The transition was jarring. The house, though filled with memories, seemed to have an oppressive aura. The rooms were large but dark, and the air felt heavy with unspoken words. I tried to adjust, putting my own needs aside for the sake of my husband and his family. Living with Margaret was an ordeal. She had a way of making everything difficult. Her constant criticism of my cooking, my decorating choices, and even my habits began to chip away at my self-esteem. It wasn't just the criticism that hurt, it was the feeling of being trapped. Every day was a battle, and I felt increasingly isolated. Mike seemed distant, lost in his own world of grief and responsibility. His support was sporadic, and when I needed him most, he was often absent. His work, which used to be a shared part of our lives, became his refuge. I was left alone with Margaret's disapproval and the overwhelming sense of losing control over my own life. As weeks turned into months, the situation worsened. Margaret's health began to decline, and her demands increased. Mike, instead of stepping up, began to retreat further into his own space. It became clear that he was overwhelmed, and his solution to the problem was one I could never have anticipated. One evening, as I sat in the dimly lit living room, Mike came to me with a request that would alter everything. He suggested that I quit my job to become a full-time caretaker for Margaret. My heart sank at the thought. My career was not just a job, it was a part of who I was. The idea of giving it up was terrifying. "Susan, I know this is a lot to ask," Mike said, his voice strained. "But Margaret needs someone here all the time. I can't do it alone. I'm barely keeping it together, and I need you." I looked at him, trying to find the man I once knew in his pleading eyes. My career, my independence, and my identity felt like they were slipping through my fingers. But how could I refuse? The weight of responsibility and the love I had for Mike made it almost impossible to say no. So I agreed. I quit my job and devoted myself to taking care of Margaret. The shift was devastating. I felt a growing resentment as my own dreams and desires were pushed aside. The house became a prison, and Margaret's constant demands left me feeling drained and unfulfilled. And then there was the growing suspicion that something was off with Mike. He had become more secretive, more withdrawn. The cheerful promises and reassurances he had given me seemed to be unraveling. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a much more complex and painful journey. As I tried to navigate this new life, a sense of betrayal began to creep into my thoughts. Mike's insistence on this arrangement was beginning to feel like a manipulation rather than a shared sacrifice. Little did I know, things were about to take a turn I couldn't have imagined. After I had reluctantly agreed to become Margaret's full-time caregiver, the initial relief of having made a decision soon turned into a painful realization of my new reality. My days became a monotonous cycle of managing Margaret's needs and coping with her ever-critical demeanor. I felt like I was living in a constant state of anxiety and discontent. Margaret's criticism was relentless. No matter how much effort I put into caring for her, it was never enough. Her disapproving remarks about my cooking or the way I managed the house made every day feel like a struggle. The things I had once taken pride in, like my creative touch with home decor or my knack for making meals, were now sources of frustration. It was as if no matter what I did, I could never meet her standards. Mike, on the other hand, seemed more distant than ever. His role as a software developer kept him occupied for long hours, and when he was home, he was often preoccupied with his own thoughts. His absence left me alone with Margaret and the growing resentment I felt towards the situation. Every night, I'd lie in bed and wonder how everything had gone so wrong. The dreams I once had about a fulfilling career and a happy life seemed to be slipping away. The situation came to a head one night when Mike came home unusually late. I was exhausted from a particularly trying day with Margaret, and the last thing I wanted was a late-night discussion. Yet, Mike wanted to talk. We sat down in the dimly lit kitchen, and he began to speak, his voice tinged with frustration. "Susan, I've been thinking," he said. "This isn't working. Margaret needs more help than I can provide, and I think you know it too." I looked at him, trying to keep my voice steady. "What are you saying, Mike? I'm already doing everything I can. I've given up my job and my independence for this." He rubbed his eyes and sighed. "I know it's hard, but I think we need more help. We can't keep doing this on our own." It wasn't just the words that stung. It was the realization that we were both stuck in a situation that was spiraling out of control. Mike's suggestion that we hire additional help was a temporary fix, but it did nothing to address the root of the problem. Our marriage was deteriorating, and the strain was taking its toll on both of us. As if things weren't complicated enough, I began to notice some troubling behavior from Mike. He was more secretive about his finances, and I found myself growing increasingly suspicious. One evening, while Margaret was napping, I decided to take a look at some of the documents that had been lying around. What I discovered was shocking. Mike had been using Margaret's savings to buy a luxury condo for himself. I felt a wave of betrayal wash over me. How could he do this? The money that was supposed to be used for Margaret's care was being spent on a new apartment? My heart pounded as I struggled to process this revelation. It felt like everything I had sacrificed for was being thrown back in my face. I confronted Mike that night, my anger barely contained. "I found out about the condo, Mike. How could you do this? You're using Margaret's money for your own gain." He looked at me with a mixture of guilt and defensiveness. "Susan, it's not what you think. I needed to make some investments. It was a business decision." "A business decision?" I snapped. "We're talking about money meant for your mother's care. How could you think this was okay?" The argument that ensued was one of the worst we'd ever had. It wasn't just about the money. It was about trust and the foundation of our marriage. I felt more isolated than ever, trapped in a situation that seemed impossible to escape. Despite the growing tension between us, I continued to care for Margaret. She began to show some signs of appreciation, perhaps realizing that I was the only one truly looking after her. But even this newfound warmth was short-lived. Margaret's health began to deteriorate rapidly. One morning, she suffered a severe stroke, and the days that followed were filled with hospital visits and uncertainty. Margaret's decline was swift and heartbreaking. The once critical mother-in-law who had made my life so difficult was now frail and vulnerable. As I watched over her, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I had endured was leading to a devastating conclusion. The final blow came with Margaret's passing. The funeral was a somber event, but it was far from the end of the turmoil. I was left to grapple with the emotional fallout and the revelations that were still to come. The day of Margaret's funeral was one of the hardest I've ever faced. The solemnity of the occasion was compounded by the bitterness that lingered in my heart. I had spent so much time and energy caring for her, and now, in the aftermath of her passing, the only thing I wanted was closure and some semblance of peace. Instead, I was about to uncover more layers of betrayal and deceit. Mike and I barely spoke during the service. His demeanor was distant, and he seemed preoccupied with his own thoughts. I couldn't help but feel that the chasm between us had only grown wider. The strain was evident in the way he avoided eye contact and in the tense silence that hung over us. It was clear that our marriage was on the brink of collapse, and I felt more alone than ever. The real shock came at the reading of Margaret's will. The lawyer's office was filled with an air of cold efficiency as we gathered to hear Margaret's final wishes. Mike and his sister, Rachel, were there, their faces set in expressions of barely concealed anticipation. I, too, was curious, though my feelings were mixed with anxiety and dread. The lawyer began to read the will, and the room fell silent as he spoke. "To my beloved daughter-in-law, Susan," he began, "I leave the entirety of my estate, including the family home and all financial assets. It is my wish that Susan will use this inheritance wisely and in the best interests of her future." I was stunned. The lawyer's words seemed to echo in my ears as he continued reading. Margaret had left everything to me and had completely disinherited Mike and Rachel. My heart raced as I tried to process the gravity of the situation. What did this mean for Mike and me? Mike's face turned pale as the lawyer read the final lines. He looked at me with a mixture of shock and anger. Rachel, too, seemed taken aback, her eyes narrowing as she processed the news. There was no mistaking the resentment that was now directed at me. After the meeting, Mike and Rachel confronted me. "Susan," Mike said, his voice tight with emotion, "how could she do this? I'm her son. I should have received something." I struggled to keep my composure. "I didn't know about this. I'm just as surprised as you are." Rachel's voice was icy. "You must have had something to do with this. There's no way Margaret would have left everything to you without some influence." I shook my head, trying to remain calm. I didn't do anything to influence her decision. She made her choice, and I have no idea why she did it. The confrontation left me feeling shaken. The accusations and the anger from Mike and Rachel were overwhelming. I was now the sole beneficiary of Margaret's estate, but it came at the cost of a shattered relationship with my husband and his family. As I began to sort through the estate, I found myself grappling with a mix of emotions. The house, once a source of tension and discomfort, now felt like a burden. The financial assets were substantial, but the weight of the responsibility was heavy. I had spent years dreaming of a different life, and now, with this inheritance, I was faced with choices I hadn't anticipated. The days following the will reading were filled with a whirlwind of activity. I was busy handling Margaret's affairs, trying to make sense of the estate, and dealing with the fallout from the will. Every decision seemed to be tinged with the bitterness of the past few months. Mike's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He seemed determined to make my life as difficult as possible. He refused to speak to me except to express his frustration and anger. The once loving relationship we had was now reduced to a series of heated arguments and bitter exchanges. One evening, as I sat alone in the house, I realized that I had to make a decision about my future. The inheritance had given me financial security, but it had come at an enormous personal cost. My marriage was in ruins, and my sense of self-worth was at an all-time low. I needed to figure out what I wanted and how to move forward. In the midst of this turmoil, a part of me began to see a glimmer of hope. Despite everything that had happened, I had the chance to rebuild my life. The inheritance was a symbol of something more, a chance to reclaim my independence and start anew. But before I could fully embrace this new possibility, I needed to confront the reality of my situation. Mike's betrayal and the collapse of our marriage had left me feeling lost and uncertain. I was left with the daunting task of deciding how to move forward, knowing that my decisions would shape the rest of my life. The truth was clear. I needed to find a way to heal and reclaim my own sense of purpose. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was also filled with the potential for new beginnings. The aftermath of Margaret's death and the fallout from the will had left me in a whirlwind of emotions. I had faced betrayal, loss, and profound change, but now, standing on the threshold of a new life, I had to decide how to move forward. Mike and I had reached the breaking point. After the will reading, he became more distant, his resentment bubbling to the surface in every interaction. One night, after a particularly heated argument, I knew that our marriage was beyond repair. The trust and love we once shared had eroded, leaving only the remnants of what we had once been. The decision to divorce Mike was painful, but it became clear that it was necessary for my own well-being. The betrayal I had experienced was not just a breach of trust, but a complete abandonment of the commitment we had made to each other. I filed for divorce, and though the process was emotionally draining, it was also a step toward reclaiming my own sense of self-worth. In the midst of this upheaval, I began to take stock of my life and the future I wanted to build. The inheritance from Margaret provided me with financial security, but it was up to me to determine how to use it. I decided to sell the large, old family home. The house, once a symbol of duty and sacrifice, had become a reminder of the pain and disillusionment I had endured. Selling it felt like shedding a layer of the past and making space for something new. As the house was put on the market and the final details of the divorce were settled, I started to envision a new future for myself. I found a cozy apartment in a different part of Seattle, one that was vibrant and full of possibilities. It was a small but comfortable space that felt like a fresh start. With the financial freedom from the sale of the house and the inheritance, I decided to pursue some of the dreams I had put on hold. I enrolled in a few art classes to reignite my passion for graphic design and started working on personal projects that had been buried beneath the weight of caregiving and marital strife. The creative outlet was a balm for my soul, helping me to rediscover the joy and fulfillment I had once found in my career. The journey to reclaiming my independence wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt and sadness, but there were also glimmers of hope and renewal. I learned to appreciate the small victories and the gradual process of rebuilding my life. The relationships with Mike and Rachel were irreparably damaged, but I began to focus on nurturing connections with friends and building new, supportive relationships. One evening, as I sat in my new apartment, reflecting on the past few years, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Despite the challenges and the heartbreak, I had managed to find a path forward. The inheritance from Margaret had been a turning point, not just in terms of financial stability, but as a catalyst for personal growth and self-discovery. As I moved forward, I was no longer defined by my past sacrifices or the pain of betrayal. Instead, I embraced the future with a renewed sense of purpose and independence. The journey had been arduous, but it had also led me to a place of strength and self-worth that I had longed for. In the end, I realized that the true measure of my journey was not just the material gains or losses, but the resilience and courage I had found within myself. I was ready to face the future on my own terms, with a heart that was finally open to new possibilities and a spirit that was free to explore the life I had always dreamed of.